Actor and director Rob Reiner and his wife Michelle have died in a, quote, tragic event. Sources tell CBS News the couple were found dead in their home in the West Los Angeles neighborhood.
The sun was still high over Brentwood on December 14, 2025, when a Hollywood dynasty was cut short. Inside the historic Fonda estate, a scene of brutal violence waited to be found. What was once a sanctuary for movie legends became a grim crime scene that stopped the industry in its tracks. As the world mourned a visionary director and his wife, a dark story began to emerge. One of a family's private pain ending in a public nightmare. 15 horrifying details in the Reiners' death are about to unfold. The daughter's discovery. The silence inside the Reiner home on South Chadbourne Avenue was the first sign that something was wrong. Romy Reiner, the couple's daughter, arrived at the house around 3 p.m. to check on her parents. She had no reason to expect anything other than the quiet of a Sunday afternoon.
TMZ has reported, and CBS News has been able to confirm through one source that it was the daughter of the couple that discovered their bodies inside the home.
Instead, she walked into the master bedroom and found a scene that would change her life forever. Her father, Rob, lay lifeless, the victim of a visible and violent struggle. In a state of pure shock, Romy fled the house. She didn't stay to search the rest of the rooms. The trauma of what she saw was immediate and overwhelming. She ran across the street to her own home, where she found a friend. Too shaken to speak clearly, she could only convey that something terrible had happened. At 3:38 p.m., the roommate placed the 911 call that brought the Los Angeles Fire Department to the door. When paramedics arrived, they made a second discovery. Rob's wife, Michelle, was also in the room, having suffered the same fate. The initial call had gone out as a medical aid request, but the responding crews quickly realized this was no accident or health crisis. They declared both victims dead at the scene and immediately called for the police. The transition from a family home to a high-profile homicide investigation took less than 10 minutes. By the time the sun set, the quiet street was lined with black and whites and yellow tape. Detectives from the Robbery Homicide Division took over, aware that they weren't just looking at a crime, but at the end of a cultural era. The most haunting detail of that afternoon remains Romy's flight, a daughter running from the very place that had always been her safest harbor. The Conan O'Brien party altercation. The violence in Brentwood did not emerge from a vacuum. It followed a public display of tension that left Hollywood's elite deeply unsettled. On the evening of Saturday, December 13th, Rob and Michelle attended a holiday party hosted by comedian Conan O'Brien. They brought their son, Nick, whose presence soon turned the festive atmosphere into a scene of concern. Guests reported that Nick's behavior was erratic from the moment he arrived, as he paced the room and freaked everyone out by repeatedly asking guests if they were famous. The situation escalated into a very loud and intense argument between Rob and Nick in front of the other attendees. The dispute was reportedly centered on Nick's deteriorating mental health and a possible relapse into harmful substance use. Witnesses described Rob as looking shaken and petrified during the exchange. At one point, the confrontation became so volatile that several guests considered calling 911. They were only talked out of it by the host, who preferred to de-escalate the matter privately within his home. The Reiners eventually left the party early, a move that many now see as a tragic turning point. Rob reportedly confided in a friend before departing, expressing a genuine fear that Nick might hurt him. This public fracture provided the first clear evidence that the decades-long struggle to stabilize Nick had reached a breaking point. The family returned to their South Chadbourne Avenue estate under a cloud of fear, unaware that the argument at the party was the final warning before a total collapse of safety. The nature of the injuries. When the Los Angeles County Medical Examiner arrived at the Reiner estate, The physical evidence told a story of extreme targeted rage. Both Rob and Michelle were found in the master bedroom.
Rocked Hollywood. This afternoon, the LA County Medical Examiner said Rob Reiner and his wife Michelle died from multiple sharp force injuries.
Victims of what the official report calls multiple sharp force injuries. This clinical term masks a much grimmer reality. The attack was not a quick or clinical event. It was a brutal and sustained assault that left no doubt about the killer's intent to end their lives. Forensic analysis suggests that the victims were caught off guard in their own sanctuary. There were no signs of a break-in, indicating that the perpetrator was someone who had easy access to the home and the master suite. The severity of the wounds, specifically lacerations to the neck and upper torso, indicated a high level of physical force. The choice of a dangerous weapon, later identified as a knife from the home's own kitchen, suggests an impulsive but devastatingly effective burst of violence. The autopsy reports, released days later, confirmed that the manner of death for both was homicide. The brutality of the scene was so extreme that one law enforcement source described it as a Hollywood horror scene nightmare. This was not just it was a physical manifestation of a fractured mind lashing out at the very people who had spent a lifetime trying to save it. The nature of the injuries served as the primary evidence used by the district attorney to file first-degree murder charges with special circumstances. But the violence inside the room was only the final chapter of a much longer, quieter struggle. The weapon recovered. The investigation into the deaths of Rob and Michelle Reiner quickly centered on the physical tools used in the attack. Forensics teams recovered a large kitchen knife from the scene that matched the sharp force injuries described in the autopsy. This was not a weapon brought from the outside, but a common household item taken from the couple's own kitchen. The choice of weapon suggests a crime of sudden, explosive impulse rather than a calculated professional hit. By using an object found within the home, the attacker turned a symbol of domestic life into a tool of absolute destruction. Blood spatter analysis and DNA testing on the handle provided the most damning evidence. Detectives found a mixture of genetic material that linked the weapon directly to the suspect. Because the knife was part of the home's existing cutlery, it also spoke to the lack of premeditation usually seen in organized homicides. There was no evidence of a murder kit or external preparation. Instead, it appeared the assailant grabbed the nearest available object during a moment of peak agitation. This detail was a key factor in the district attorney's decision to file first-degree murder charges, as the use of a dangerous and deadly weapon adds significant weight to the prosecution's case. The recovery of the weapon also helped investigators rule out other theories. Early speculation about a botched robbery or a targeted political assassination began to fade when it became clear the killer used what was already there. The knife remained in the house after the attack, left behind as the perpetrator fled into the night. Nick Reiner's troubled history. To understand how such a tragedy could occur, investigators looked back at the decades of struggle that defined Nick Reiner's life. Since his teenage years, the 32-year-old had been caught in a cycle of harmful substance addiction and mental health crises. His parents, Rob and Michelle, were well known in Hollywood circles not just for their work, but for their relentless devotion to their son's recovery. Nick had been through at least 18 different rehabilitation facilities across the country, a statistic that highlights both the depth of his illness and the sheer scale of his parents' efforts to help him. Despite the Reiners' vast resources, stability remained out of reach for Nick. He had experienced periods of homelessness and was frequently in and out of specialized care. Those who knew the family described a nightmare dynamic where Rob and Michelle were constantly balancing their love for their son with the reality of his erratic behavior. In the months leading up to the incident, friends noticed that the situation had become increasingly volatile. Nick had been living on the property in a guest house, a proximity that allowed his parents to monitor him, but also placed them directly in the line of fire when his condition worsened. The history of Nick's struggles was even immortalized in the 2015 film Being Charlie, which he co-wrote with his father. The movie was a semi-autobiographical look at a young man's battle with addiction, intended to be a therapeutic collaboration. At the time, it was hailed as a sign of healing, but in hindsight, it reveals the long-standing fractures within the family. Law enforcement sources indicate that Nick's history of dangerous and erratic behavior was well documented, making the eventual eruption of violence a tragedy that felt, to some, like a horrific inevitability. The famous obsession. As investigators spoke to those present at the O'Brien holiday party, a disturbing pattern emerged regarding Nick's mental state. Witnesses described his behavior not just as erratic, but as hyper-fixated on a specific delusional theme. He reportedly moved through the crowd of A-list celebrities, cornering them with a single repetitive question. Are you famous? This wasn't a casual inquiry, but an intense, wide-eyed interrogation that left guests like Courtney Cox and Julia Louis-Dreyfus visibly shaken. This fame obsession appeared to be a manifestation of a deeper psychotic break, where the reality of his parents' iconic status became a source of direct agitation. This behavior served as a massive red flag that went beyond his usual struggles with addiction. Sources close to the family suggest that Nick had grown increasingly resentful of the Reiner legacy and the shadow it cast over his own life. At the party, this resentment allegedly boiled over into a public spectacle. He wasn't just acting out. He was signaling a total loss of touch with social boundaries and reality. When Rob attempted to intervene and calm him down, Nick's response was reportedly cold and defiant, marking the final time many in the industry would see the father and son together before the tragedy. The obsession with fame is particularly haunting, given the setting. Nick grew up in the heart of Hollywood royalty, yet he often spoke in interviews about feeling like a prop in a world he didn't fit into. On that final Saturday night, that feeling seemed to mutate into something dangerous. By the time the Reiners left the party, the famous obsession had set the stage for a confrontation at home. It provided a chilling motive for the violence that followed. A son struggling to reconcile his own identity against the overwhelming public personas of the parents who were desperately trying to save him. The security log discrepancies. The Reiner estate on South Chadbourne Avenue was a fortress of modern security, equipped with high-definition cameras and a sophisticated alarm system. However, when detectives reviewed the digital logs from the night of the murders, they found no evidence of a breach. There were no tripped sensors on the perimeter and no forced entry at any of the doors. Instead, the logs showed a series of internal movements that told a much more intimate story. The system recorded the front gate opening at approximately 10:45 p.m. for the family's return, and then nothing until the early hours of the morning. The most critical discrepancy was found in the motion sensor data within the main house. Between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., sensors picked up movement in the kitchen and then in the hallway leading to the master suite. This movement didn't trigger an alarm because the system recognized it as occurring from within the safe zone of the residence. The logs effectively trapped the killer inside the house, proving that the threat didn't come from the dark streets of Brentwood, but from a bedroom just down the hall. This data was the first piece of evidence that pivoted the LAPD's focus entirely toward Nick. Furthermore, the external cameras failed to show anyone leaving the property through the main exits until much later. This suggested the killer knew the blind spots of the estate, areas where the cameras didn't overlap, or where a side gate could be accessed without triggering a floodlight. The security system, designed to protect the Reiners from the outside world, had instead documented their final moments from the inside. It turned the home into a digital cage, where every footstep was logged with mathematical precision, eventually providing the timeline that would lead to Nick's arrest near the USC campus. The roommate's 911 call. The panic of that December afternoon is forever preserved in a 3-minute audio recording from the Los Angeles Fire Department. It wasn't Romy who spoke to the dispatcher, but her roommate, who had accompanied her to the house. The call, placed at 3:38 p.m., begins with a voice trembling so violently it is nearly indecipherable. "We need an ambulance. I think they're dead," the roommate tells the operator. In the background, the sounds of Romy's guttural screams provide a haunting soundtrack to the emergency request. It was the sound of a daughter's world collapsing in real time. The roommate explains that they found Rob first, lying in the master bedroom with blood everywhere. At this point in the call, they were still unaware that Michelle was also in the room, obscured by the aftermath of the struggle. The dispatcher tries to guide the caller through CPR instructions, but the roommate's response is chillingly final. "It's too late. He's cold. He's gone." This detail would later become a key piece of the forensic timeline, suggesting that the murders had occurred many hours before the discovery, likely in the quiet, early hours of the morning. Throughout the recording, the roommate desperately tries to comfort Romy while providing the South Chadbourne Avenue address. The call ends abruptly as the first sirens of the LAFD reach the property. For investigators, this tape was more than just a call for help. It was a snapshot of the raw trauma that defined the crime scene. It captured the exact moment a private family tragedy became a matter of public record, stripping away the Hollywood glamour to reveal the stark, cold reality of a double homicide. The diagnosis of schizophrenia. While Nick's struggle with addiction was a matter of public record,
The deaths of Rob Reiner and his wife, Michelle. Their son, Nick, his struggle with addiction has become a focal point.
And Nick Reiner about his struggles, his setbacks, and attempts at staying sober.
a far more complex factor began to surface in the days following the murders. Sources close to the family revealed that Nick had recently received a diagnosis of schizophrenia.
Hollywood icon Rob Reiner and his wife Michelle. Sources say the couple's 32-year-old son, Nick, had been diagnosed with schizophrenia years ago and was battling the disorder in recent weeks.
This condition, which can cause profound breaks from reality, added a terrifying layer to his existing history of harmful substance abuse. Friends stated that Michelle had been increasingly worried about his dangerous and erratic state, specifically noting that he seemed to be experiencing a severe psychotic episode in the weeks leading up to the holiday party. The intersection of mental illness and substance abuse, often called a dual diagnosis, is notoriously difficult to treat. In Nick's case, it created a volatile internal environment that even the best medical professionals struggled to manage. Reports suggest that Nick may have stopped taking his prescribed antipsychotic medication or had an adverse reaction to a new dosage, which could have triggered the paranoia witnessed at the O'Brien party. This medical context doesn't excuse the violence, but it provides a window into the fractured mind that the district attorney's office mentioned during his charging. The diagnosis also explains the specific nature of his behavior, such as the fixation on fame and the lack of a clear, logical motive. In a state of active psychosis, the boundaries of the home and the identity of the parents can become distorted. For Rob and Michelle, this diagnosis was the final, insurmountable wall they tried to climb to save their son. They were no longer just fighting a harmful substance habit. They were trying to navigate a neurological crisis that eventually turned their own son into a stranger capable of the unthinkable. Understanding the tragedy required looking past the bloodstains and into the fractured mind of the accused. The history of the home. The Reiner estate on South Chadbourne Avenue was more than just a house. It was a landmark of Hollywood history. Before Rob and Michelle moved in, The property had been home to other legends, including the Fonda family and director Norman Lear. For decades, it served as a hub for creativity and political activism, where the biggest names in Washington and Los Angeles gathered for fundraisers and strategy meetings. The fact that such a storied sanctuary became the site of a double homicide added a layer of historical irony to the tragedy. It was a place built on the legacy of American storytelling, yet it ended up hosting a scene that no screenwriter would have dared to pitch. The layout of the home, while sprawling and beautiful, also played a role in the grim timeline of discovery. Because of its size, it was possible for different events to unfold in separate wings without immediate notice. However, it was the master bedroom, the most private space in the house, that became the center of the forensic investigation. Detectives spent days mapping the interior, noting how the architecture of the home, designed for grand living and privacy, had inadvertently shielded the crime from the outside world during the early morning hours. In the days following the murders, the house was transformed. The vibrant gardens were replaced by yellow police tape, and the quiet neighborhood was filled with news vans and floral tributes. Fans and peers alike noted the tragedy of the setting. A man who had spent his life creating stories about love, friendship, and justice met his end in the very place he felt safest. The Brentwood silence that now hangs over the estate is a haunting reminder that even the most prestigious walls cannot always keep out the deepest family sorrows. The flight to USC. After the violence in the early morning hours of December 14th, Nick Reiner did not stay at the Brentwood estate. Instead, he embarked on a frantic and seemingly aimless flight across Los Angeles. Police tracking his movements through cell phone data and city cameras found that he traveled approximately 14 miles toward the University of Southern California campus. He was not driving a high-end vehicle associated with his family's wealth. Instead, he was found on foot, moving through the Exposition Park area. This flight suggests a state of total confusion and a lack of any long-term plan to evade capture. When LAPD officers finally closed in on Nick at 9:15 p.m. that Sunday, they did not find a defiant fugitive. Witnesses and police reports describe him as appearing dazed and exhausted. He did not resist arrest when the shout-out came from the officers on the scene.
New video from a gas station where Nick Reiner is spotted buying a drink right before he was arrested. Eyewitness News reporter Anthony Carlo has the new video as the arrest also happened.
The location of his arrest, near a bustling university campus, stood in sharp contrast to the quiet, wealthy streets he had fled. It was here, miles from the blood-stained master bedroom in Brentwood, that the manhunt ended and the legal process began. The flight to USC became a critical part of the prosecution's narrative. While Nick's defense may argue that his movements were the result of a mental health crisis, the act of leaving the scene is often used by the state to suggest a consciousness of guilt. For the public, the image of a son wandering the streets of Los Angeles while his parents lay dead in their home was one of the most chilling details of the entire report. It highlighted the complete breakdown of a man who had nowhere else to go and no one left to turn to. The unlocked side gate. While the main house was a digital fortress, the investigation uncovered a small but fatal physical vulnerability. Forensic teams found a side gate on the 200 block of South Chadbourne Avenue that was unlocked and slightly ajar. Unlike the main entry points, this gate was in a blind spot, not fully covered by the estate's 24-hour surveillance cameras. This unlocked gate provided a silent path into the property, allowing someone familiar with the home's layout to move toward the master suite without triggering external floodlights or perimeter alarms. For the LAPD, this detail was a major piece of the puzzle. An intruder would have struggled to find this specific entry point in the dark, but for someone who lived on the property, it was a known shortcut. This gate led directly toward the area where Nick Reiner had been staying in a guest house on the family grounds. The fact that it was left open suggested a hurried exit, a physical sign of the erratic and panicked flight that followed the violence inside. It served as a bridge between the peace of the neighborhood and the horror that had occurred within the master bedroom. As detectives processed the scene, the unlocked gate became a symbol of the tragedy's intimacy. The Reiners had invested heavily in security to protect themselves from the outside world, but they had left a literal and figurative door open for their son. This small lapse in the estate's defense was not a failure of technology, but a testament to the trust they still held for a family member. It was through this quiet, unprotected gap that the night's peace was shattered, proving that the most dangerous threats often come from the people we leave the gate open for. The discarded formal wear. One of the most chilling forensic details found by investigators involved the clothing worn by the family on their final night together. In a waste receptacle near the back of the house, detectives recovered a set of formal wear, items that Rob and Michelle had worn to the Conan O'Brien holiday party just hours earlier. The clothing was not simply thrown away. It had been handled in a way that suggested an attempt to hide or dispose of evidence of the earlier argument. This discovery added a layer of disturbing premeditation to a crime that otherwise seemed fueled by a sudden psychotic break. The contrast between the elegance of the formal wear and the brutality of the crime scene was a shock, even to veteran officers. These were the clothes of a Hollywood power couple at the peak of their influence, found discarded in the trash near a blood-stained bedroom. Forensic testing on the fabric revealed traces of the same multiple sharp force injuries that took the couple's lives.
Rob Reiner was a brilliant actor and director, an iconic force in our entertainment industry. His wife, Michelle Singer-Reiner, was an equally iconic photographer and producer. Their loss is beyond tragic.
It appeared the killer had moved between the high society world of a celebrity party and the dark reality of a double homicide with terrifying speed, stopping only to strip away the outward signs of their shared life. This detail also helped prosecutors establish a timeline. By finding the clothes the victims were wearing when they were last seen alive by witnesses, the medical examiner could more accurately estimate the time of death. It confirmed that the attack happened shortly after the family returned from the party, likely while the adrenaline from the public argument was still high. The discarded suits and dresses were the last remnants of the Reiners' public personas, cast aside in the dark before their private lives ended in a final, silent struggle. But the tragedy that occurred behind closed doors was quickly swept into a much louder, more public war. The political backlash. In the wake of the tragedy, the grief was quickly punctured by a harsh political reality. Rob Reiner was not just a filmmaker. He was one of the most visible and vocal liberal activists in the country. Because of this, his death became a flashpoint for a deeply divided nation. While figures like Barack Obama and Bill Clinton issued statements of profound sorrow, a different tone emerged from others. Donald Trump took to Truth Social to post a message that many called horrifying and disrespectful, suggesting that Reiner's own political passions and Trump derangement syndrome were somehow connected to the violence he faced. This backlash turned a private family mourning period into a public battlefield. High-profile supporters of the former president echoed these sentiments, using the tragedy to mock Reiner's long history of advocacy for social justice and LGBTQ+ rights. The cruelty of the online response was a shock to the Reiner family, who found themselves defending their parents' legacy while simultaneously planning their funerals. Even some conservative lawmakers, such as Thomas Massie and Marjorie Taylor Greene, felt compelled to speak out against the vitriol, reminding the public that this was a family tragedy that transcended political lines. The politicization of the crime scene highlighted a new, darker era of American discourse. For decades, the Reiners had used their platform to fight for what they believed in, from early childhood education to marriage equality. Seeing that lifetime of work weaponized against them in their final hours was a detail that many friends found as painful as the murders themselves. It served as a grim reminder that in the modern age, not even a brutal double homicide is safe from the reach of partisan warfare. The backlash didn't just target the victims. It sought to strip them of their humanity at the moment they were most vulnerable. The final joint statement. The final detail of the report is perhaps the most heartbreaking. The joint statement released by the surviving Reiner children, Jake and Romy. In a world obsessed with the meathead persona and the spinal tap legacy, the statement brought the focus back to the quiet reality of their home life. They did not speak of their father as a Hollywood giant or their mother as a renowned photographer. Instead, they simply described Rob and Michelle as their best friends. They wrote about the unimaginable pain of losing the two people who had been their primary sources of stability and love, even amidst the long struggle to help their brother, Nick. The statement also served as a plea for privacy and a rejection of the political noise surrounding the case. It reflected the values that Rob and Michelle had instilled in them: decency, empathy, and a focus on family. The children noted that their parents had spent their lives trying to make the world a better place, and that their special force together was something that could never be replaced. This final message was a stark contrast to the brutality of the crime scene and the coldness of the political backlash. It was a reminder that behind the headlines and the forensic reports were two human beings who were deeply loved by those who knew them best. As the legal case against Nick moves forward, this statement remains the definitive word on the Reiner legacy. It shifted the narrative away from the horror scene nightmare and back toward the decades of kindness and creativity that the couple left behind. The final joint statement wasn't just a goodbye. It was a testament to a marriage that lasted 35 years, and a family that, despite its deep fractures, remained rooted in love. What do you think of these horrifying details? Write your comments below and subscribe now to stay informed as this story continues to unfold.